Okay, what we're talking about is the causes of the revolution, and if you look at the next screen, you're going to find the essential question that you need to write at the top of your paper. The key term here is the word justified. Make sure that you have a clear understanding of that before you answer the question. Now, you may not find that information in the notes, but make sure that you speak to somebody else about it. You look in the dictionary, that again, you understand that word in particular, because if you don't understand the word justified, you're not going to be able to answer the question. First thing we want to start with is the idea of natural rights. This is an important point because if you consider carefully at the end, one of the main reasons why the colonists were looking at this situation over the about 10 years we're going to talk about, they look at the fact that something that they've considered from the very beginning to be theirs, that is natural rights, has been violated again and again. So the first idea here is that you need to know is that every Englishman assumed that they had these. This is not something that some thought they did and some thought they didn't. From probably about 150 years prior to the American Revolution, natural rights were a common idea that Englishmen believed everybody had. And so let's focus on the word natural first. Natural is something that obviously doesn't come from government. So we know that it's not from government. So the question comes then, where do the rights come from? If they don't come from government, where do they come from? And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, you're going to see a reference to natural rights, and you're going to see this one word right next to it. So there was this understanding that natural rights were something that everyone had because they were created the same way. That in some way they were made equal, and therefore they were equal in terms of their rights. And so the main idea then of the Declaration is that all people have these. So these rights are also universal. All people have them. And they all have them because they were made by the same creator, according to the Declaration of Independence. The main rights we're talking about here, and you can see these in the Declaration, are the rights of life, liberty, and property. Now you don't see the word property in the Declaration, you see the words pursuit of happiness. But the idea of property came from a man by the name of John Locke. And John Locke was a philosopher in England in the early 1700s, and he was very influential on many of the founding fathers, in particular Thomas Jefferson. And his idea of property was key here because of the fact that he understood that everybody had things that were particularly close to them, very valuable to them, that they considered property. So don't think of the word property as land only. Think about all the other things that you own that aren't land. And unfortunately, some people at the time only thought of it as property, whereas they should have been thinking about it differently. And so Thomas Jefferson perhaps changes the words in the Declaration to pursuit of happiness, whatever that is that makes you happy, which could be owning property or could be something else. The first event that really sparks criticism by the colonists is based upon really something that happens in the French and Indian War. When the war is over, there are an awful lot of British soldiers that are in this area here, the Ohio River Valley. There are forts that are there, and there are British soldiers that are there, and they were there because of the fact that there were still Indians in that area, despite the fact that the French had left, and those Indians were still hostile. And the concern they had was that if they allowed colonists to move from the colonies into this area, that would require an increase in the need for soldiers, that there would be more of them necessary. So what they did was they created a line, and they drew that line along the Appalachian Mountains, and they referred to it as the Proclamation Line. So that line would have looked right about here. There was a line that was drawn along the mountains, and the line became then a border. It said that you can't go across the line. So at the bottom of the screen you see it says this prevented. It prevented the colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio River Valley. Now, again, the main reason. Why do they draw the line? There's a concern about having to send more soldiers. Well, why are they concerned about that? We come down to really the main idea here of many of the acts that you're going to see, and that is that the concern over the need for soldiers is really a concern about money. The idea that if we send soldiers, we have to spend more money. If we encourage the movement of people to that area, it's going to cost us more money. And why would it cost us more money? Well, people that move from here into the Ohio Valley aren't going to be where those ships are going to come in. They're going to do all that trading. So we're shifting people from one place to another, costing us money in terms of protection, cost us money in terms of trade. None of this is good for Britain as far as they're concerned. The result is they want to draw that line. They want to enforce the movement of people or restrict the movement of people and enforce this line so that they can't occupy that territory. And the main concern or complaint that they have about this is, remember that this French and Indian War, this is something that the colonists fought in. This is something that they died in. Many of them lost, fathers and brothers and sons, and now they're told that the area of land or the piece of land that they've won, they're not allowed to have. The Sugar Act is really not, just so you understand, it's not the first act that the British passed. There were other acts passed before 1764. Many of them had to do with trade. Most of them were rules and regulations that were referred to as navigation acts that restricted the ability of the colonists to trade with different countries. So many of them, the focus of those navigation acts was in fact always England first when it came to trade. So if you were going to trade with somebody, send it to England first and then let them do trading with other countries. The Sugar Act becomes one of the first times that we see a restriction placed upon the colonists, where they're told that they can't buy certain things unless. And so when you see the word sugar, obviously, you're assuming that it's granulated stuff. It's really not. The word act, by the way, is just another word for law. What this tax was primarily molasses. And molasses was a very much an important part of the diet of most people in the colonies, in particular in New England, where molasses was turned into rum. And it was used on ships then by most of the sailors. The intent of this particular tax was to pay for the debt of the 7 Years' War. So we talked about the idea that there was a money issue with the English, and the debt that existed after the 7 Years' War was so great that the English began to pass these taxes in order to pay for that war, to pay that debt. Notice something here. The sugar we're talking about, this comes from the West Indies. The sugar is imported. It's not something the colonists can get without paying the tax. And if they want to avoid the tax, the only way that they can do that is really by smuggling, by bringing the sugar in illegally from the West Indies. And many of them begin to do that, and they become very good at it, sneaking the sugar in and selling it then on what we would call today the black market. So the result is that most colonists, if they aren't participating in smuggling and if they aren't buying the smuggled molasses, all they really do with regards to this is they begin to complain. They begin to grumble about it. The same way maybe your parents or we complain about the price of food at the grocery store or the price of gasoline at the gas station. The complaints don't amount to much, but you can already see that there's this disagreement with the policies. There's also this dislike of the fact that the cost of living is increasing. And we're going to see that the cost of living in the colonies is going to increase in other ways with other acts that are passed. The Quartering Act then is passed in 1765, and this is really meant as a way to to help pay for those soldiers. Because you could have just simply passed a tax to pay for soldiers, but instead what they did was they didn't pass a tax. They simply told the colonists, well, guess what? We don't want your money. We want you to directly provide for the soldiers. And it required the colonists to provide basically three things: food for the soldiers living in their community, fuel or firewood for the soldiers living in their community, and shelter, which at the time was not living in someone's home. It was actually a place to put your tent, a place for the army to put their camp. The colonists at this point, what this does for the colonists is that they begin to really distrust the redcoats. They look upon them as invaders. They look upon them as being disruptive to their lifestyle, to their homes, and in particular cutting into their ability to provide for their families, because they have to take a portion of what they grow or a portion of what they buy and they have to give it to the redcoats. So they have to take a portion of the firewood that they cut and they have to give it to the redcoats, which obviously means that they have to increase the amount of time that they spend growing food or cutting wood, and that again affects their families. And so this distrust of the redcoats, this dislike of the redcoats is growing, and it's something that's going to only get worse. The Stamp Act is really the first act that riles the colonists to the point where they begin doing something other than just complaining or just smuggling. And why is it the most dreaded act? Well, it has an awful lot to do with what it taxed. It taxes anything that's printed. So, for instance, if you bought a newspaper, there was a tax on the newspaper. But if you had to file a document with the local government, a birth certificate, for instance, there's a tax on that. A marriage license, there's a tax on that. A death certificate, there's a tax on that. Any kind of contract for business, there's a tax on that. Anything that was printed, that was any kind of legal document, these things were all stamped. And the stamp was not a lick it and stick it kind of stamp. A stamp was, or even a peel it and paste it. It was a stamp that was embedded in the paper. And so it was very, very difficult to, number one, to kind of cover up or to duplicate. You really had to have the proper tools in order to do that. And so this begins to affect, because it taxes all these different printed items, and you should know examples of the different printed items. It begins to affect everybody in society. Merchants, businessmen, ship owners, even people that are farmers. They're going to have births and deaths and marriages and so on. They're going to buy pieces of property, and all these documents are going to have to get taxed. And there's really no way around this, because such documents need to be printed. In a legal sense, people want these things printed so that they have a clear and accurate record of the things that are occurring that they can save for a prolonged period of time. The result is we get a group called the Sons of Liberty. And they are basically what we would call today, well, they're protesters, but they're more activists. They're very much involved in organizing protests and being very active in their communities. The Sons of Liberty start in Boston. And then there are other groups very like them that begin to crop up in other colonies. But they really do begin in Boston. And so as a group of men, most of them were very intelligent, well-educated businessmen. They were out there on a regular basis and meeting with each other on a regular basis and really thinking about how can we combat the British and what they're doing? How can we defend ourselves against these attacks on our natural rights? And you might be wondering, well, what natural rights? Well, the right to property in particular. And their tactics that they used sometimes went, well, over the edge. It was not unusual, for instance, for them to protest in front of the stamp master's office. So the guy who was in charge of collecting the stamp taxes, they would get out there and they would stand in front of his office and protest. And sometimes those protests turn into the throwing of rocks. Sometimes that protest turned into what we call tar and feathering. And tarring and feathering wasn't something, and you can see this in the picture here. This guy seems to have very feathery legs. He's been dunked in tar, which is an oily substance. A lot of, in Boston, there were a lot of big barrels of tar. It was the number one thing that they used to seal the inside of ships. So they would spread it on the wood to seal the wood, to make things waterproof. And so they would take these guys and dunk them in the tar, cover them in feathers. This was not something that if you were actually covered from head to toe in this is not something you would survive. Your skin would begin to suffocate. If you tried to peel it off, it would peel off pieces of your skin. If you got it into your eyes, your ears, your nose, getting it out was very difficult once it kind of solidified. So this was a nasty kind of thing that happened. And very often if you got tarred and feathered, you were carried around the town and people then began to throw things at you because they recognized who you were, and the fact that you were being really treated this way was a symbol of the fact that you were somebody that couldn't be trusted. They also would, and you can kind of see the noose here. I don't know of any records of anybody being hung, but I do know that they would sometimes make a dummy of you, and they would, if you were the guy that they didn't like, they'd make something that looks like you, and they'd stick you in the noose out in front of your house, out in front of your office, and they'd hang you there as a reminder to you. This is what might happen to you if you come outside, so don't come outside. So their tactics weren't just simply protests. Their tactics were, in many cases, harassment. And sometimes that harassment went so far as to injure people severely. The colonists are also going to organize something known as the Stamp Act Congress. They meet in New York, and they are going to, and not all the colonies meet in this Congress. The Congress is only a gathering of representatives in some way. And this meeting in New York is going to focus on the Stamp Act. But one of the more important things that comes out of this, a meeting of colonists and meeting of the colonies, is that they get the phrase, no taxation without representation. This is the first time we see it written down as part of a statement, a joint statement made by the colonies. And this becomes then sort of the rallying phrase, the rallying cry of the colonists when they talk to each other. What is it really all about? Why are we so upset? Well, we're not upset just because we don't believe in taxation. It's not just no taxation. It's no taxation unless we have something else. And what is the something else? Well, it's representation. But what does that mean? Representation refers to the fact that there's nobody in Parliament. Parliament is essentially the Congress of Great Britain. But there's nobody in Parliament that represents the people of the colonies. There's people all over England, and they have representatives that are in Parliament. But the people that are in the colonies have no representatives in Parliament. And that's really their concern. Who speaks for them? And remember, representatives are people that you elect, people that you vote for, not people that are selected for you that then are supposed to represent you. And there's nobody in Parliament that does that. One of the other kind of interesting things we see that happens at this time is we see for the first time that ministers, the guys who are standing in charge of and standing up in front of churches, they begin to speak out. And they don't just speak out publicly. They are going to speak out on a regular basis on Sunday mornings in their churches, reminding the people of their natural rights, reminding the people of their rights as Englishmen, and pointing out the violation of their rights. And this becomes a regular kind of thing on Sunday morning that people experience. And the result is that people, a broad base of people, a wide variety of people, people that were rich and people that were poor, people that were in the middle, all begin to understand the ideas and the problems in the same way. Because of all this, because of the Sons of Liberty, because of the harassment, because of the Stamp Act Congress, because of the fact that people are getting more mobilized now that the churches are beginning to focus on this, the British end up repealing the Stamp Act. And what that means is they take it away. They pass a law that unpasses the law, if you want to understand it that way. And you do need to do that. As a Congress today, as a Parliament then, you need to, in order to get rid of a law, you have to pass a law that gets rid of the law that you want to get rid of. So it's somewhat of a complicated process because you have to get people to vote on it. And the British do repeal it. This is I guess I call it a political cartoon. It's a drawing that made its way into a newspaper. And one of the important things about this, as you can see, is this seems to be kind of like a funeral procession. As a matter of fact, you can see right here there is a sort of a small coffin. And you've got the skulls here that sort of symbolize the idea of death. And what appears to be like ministers up here, like they're leading this procession, this funeral procession, and people seem very, very sad. Back here we seem to have other people that might represent ministers. But the important point here is of this particular drawing is this thing right here. That's the Stamp Act. This is the funeral procession for the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act has been repealed, and now the result is that it's dead. And so this drawing was to remind the colonists, found in newspapers, this is what happened to the Stamp Act. And of course there's all these people that are sad, but who are these people? Well, they're not the loyal colonists. These people are in fact the people that are the stamp masters and the people that were the judges, the people that passed judgments on people when they didn't pay their taxes. These are the people that are mourning. One of the interesting things I always like to point out is look at the dog. The dog's lifting his leg on the guy carrying the Stamp Act. We're going to see that dog a little bit later. This is sort of a comment by the colonists. Here you are sad. You're going through this funeral procession. You're going off to bury the Stamp Act in a sense. And this is what we think of the Stamp Act. The Declaratory Act was passed actually hours after the Stamp Act was repealed, so it's the same year. And what it says is that Parliament can make any law that it wants, and that the colonists are required to follow any law that the Parliament makes. And so what they really wanted to do here is they wanted to remind the colonists of something that I think the colonists already recognized. They don't want the colonists to have the wrong impression. And that is that if you protest enough and you throw a big enough fit, that Parliament will turn around and change their mind, and that the result will be that you'll get your way, sort of like a child throwing a temper tantrum. But instead they want the colonists to remember that Parliament is the end-all when it comes to laws, that they make the decisions, that everybody else follows those decisions. And so Parliament is known as the higher law. That if you look at the order of things, if a colony were to make a law, and that law were to be in disagreement with a law that Parliament makes, the result would be that the colony's law would not be followed. The colony's law would be what most people would be void, without power. And so Parliament is the higher law. When we look at our own country, for instance, we recognize the Constitution as the higher law, that all things are always compared to it rather than to some state law or some local law. And so the colonists already understood this. Their problem wasn't that Parliament was making laws, it's that they didn't have representatives in Parliament that they could contribute to the conversation about what those laws should look like and how those laws should be written. The Townshend Acts in 1768 were rather unique. They taxed a variety of things, all of which were imported. So things like paint and lead and glass and tea. These items all had to be brought into the colonies from other places. Now the British knew that if you bring things in from outside and you tax them, if things come into the colonies from other places and they're taxed, the main reaction of the colonists is going to be to smuggle. And so what the British did was they passed these things called the writs of assistance. The writs of assistance are kind of like a search warrant. The difference is that in a search warrant, the authorities have to specify the time and the place and the things that they expect to find. So they can't just simply show up at your house with a search warrant and say, we're searching. The search warrant has to specify these things at this place at this time, and it has to be signed by a judge. The writ of assistance, however, was part of the Townshend Acts in terms of it being law, and what it allowed people to do is the stamp master, with the help of the redcoats, were allowed to search any place at any time for any reason. So it was an open invitation to search for, and again, what they're looking for is smuggled goods. So they're going to break into warehouses, and they're going to look for things that don't have the proper documentation saying that they were taxed. The crazy thing about this was that it allowed the stamp master to keep 1/3 of the value of the things that were actually taken. So if they discover that you've got $100,000 worth of something that you shouldn't have in your warehouse, you smuggled in a bunch of glass or lead, the result is, or some paint or something like that, the result is that they got to keep, the tax master got to keep 1/3 of the value of that, so $33,000 worth. There's a great motivation then to find smuggled goods. This is the point of the writs of assistance. Motivate the guys who are supposed to enforce the law to go out and enforce the law. Give them some sort of reward for doing that. The problem is that it leads to a large number of people being falsely accused. People that are harassed because there's this motivation on the part of the stamp masters to find the smugglers and to capture that or confiscate that smuggled goods. So the only way that the colonists can respond to this particular act is to boycott. The boycott really is something that it's somewhat of a passive kind of thing. That is, you just don't buy stuff. It's you don't do something, not that you do something. And so the boycott results in people not buying the paint and the lead and the glass and so on, and the tea. They begin, for instance, to drink coffee. They begin to cover their windows. If the glass breaks, they'll cover them with cloth that is dipped in wax so that it keeps out the moisture, but it lets in the light. They'll find other ways of doing the things that they need to do rather than buying the products from England to avoid the taxes. But the result is this, that a large number of ships that were coming into ports in Virginia and into Massachusetts and into Delaware and into New York, a lot of those ships aren't showing up anymore. People aren't buying things. There's no need to send things to the colonies. The result is that there's less business going on. And you might think, well, what's the big deal? The British are losing the business, not that the colonists are. But remember, every one of those ports that I mentioned, every one of them have people in them that rely upon those ships coming in. They rely upon the ships showing up and the sailors getting something to eat, finding a place to stay, buying certain products. They rely upon those ships having to have repairs done, sails to be made, ropes that were purchased, and things like that. That they were picking up goods that the colonists were making and sending them back to England. And all those things have kind of stopped. The result is that in a lot of the seaports along the East Coast, there's a large number of people that are unemployed. And that unemployment is something that's going to, over time, of course, drive people to do things that are more drastic. An example of this is the Boston Massacre. And we start here with that at the top. Remember that the anti-British feelings are very high. Why? Well, because in Boston in particular, Boston is kind of a strange town in the sense that it's a very small peninsula at the time, almost roundish like, and you could stand in the middle of Boston and see ships all the way around Boston on every side. And Boston has been particularly hard hit by the Townsend Acts and the unemployment that's rampant as a result of the Townsend Acts and the boycotts that resulted from it. So the unemployment is very high, and unemployed laborers are picketing outside the customs house. Now the customs house is customs is the thing you have to go through when you bring something into the country in order to pay your taxes. So this is where the taxes are applied to imports. And the guy that is doing this, the tax master, the guy who's in charge of it, who's in charge of the customs house, his job is to go out, or has people that go out to the ships and they itemize and sort of write down everything that's on the ship, figure out what needs to be taxed, how many taxes have to be applied to it, and so on. The customs house is where this guy lives, where this guy works, where the records are kept, and so on. So they're out there protesting in front of this customs house. And the protests over a period of hours get more and more aggressive. The redcoats are called out, and they are called out to protect the customs house, to protect the tax master. And then what happens as the words and the things that are being said get more and more heated, the redcoats are getting more and more tense, the people begin to throw rocks and chunks of ice at the redcoats. This is early March in 1770, so that in the evening things still freeze up. If there's any water on the ground, it tends to freeze up still. It's still pretty cold. And it gets more and more tense. And then for some reason, somebody, it's believed now that it was probably a colonist, but somebody yells fire. The reason why we say that is there's no evidence that it was the redcoats that said it. But somebody yells fire, and the result is the redcoats lower their guns, they fire their guns into the crowd, and 5 people are killed. And this, of course, is branded a massacre. And you might think, well, 5 people, how could that be a massacre? That's not that many. And the reality is, of course, in the colonies, people don't die from getting shot. If they die from accidents, they die from illnesses, they die from diseases, or they die perhaps from getting stabbed if they're unlucky, or perhaps getting themselves beat up too severely in a bar fight. But dying from a gunshot, that just doesn't happen. 5 people dying from a gunshot, that just really doesn't happen. This is a massacre. And of course, the colonists, the Sons of Liberty, make this out to be much more perhaps than it really is. What happens to the redcoats, just so you know, is that they are arrested, they're taken to trial, and they hire none other than John Adams to be their lawyer, and they get off. They're not accused of their crime because it becomes very obvious that they didn't give the order, somebody else yelled fire. And you might wonder, well, why would they do that? Well, somebody in the crowd yells fire so that the redcoats fire, so that the redcoats look bad. It's really a way of making the redcoats come out, looking the wrong way rather than the right way. But this is what's published in newspapers afterwards. This is the Bloody Massacre at Boston, and this was actually created by. It's actually an engraving. It's not actually a print. So Paul Revere takes a piece of metal, engraves this picture, and then it is used to print pictures, and those pictures are colored. And what you see here is something that, well, it doesn't really fit with the facts. For instance, notice here that it appears that this guy is yelling fire. There's no evidence that he ever did. It appears that the redcoats have fired more than once. Why is that? Well, look at all the people that are bleeding here on the ground, and the redcoats have just fired, and people have just been hit, and they're not on the ground as if they fired more than once. There's no evidence they fired any more than one time. Now, it looks kind of strange. There's a moon up here, and the reason is it happened in the evening. Of course, you can't make a picture at night because then the picture would be dark and then you wouldn't be able to see it. So Paul Revere puts the moon up there in the corner for that reason. Notice something here, the dog's back. I don't know if it's the same dog. Maybe it is. The tea acts passed in 1773. This is not a tax. And this is one of the few acts where the British government is not going to tax the colonists directly. And here's part of the reason, and really something that's important. When the Townshend Acts resulted in all this violence, the Townshend Acts were repealed. Except for the tax on tea. So they got rid of all the taxes from the Townshend Acts, and they left the tax on tea very quietly. So we don't need to tax tea. It's already taxed. This particular act is not a tax on tea. Instead, what it does is it creates a monopoly. It gives to a British company called the British East India Company a monopoly. They have the sole right to trade tea in the colonies. The British government is practicing something that today we might call crony capitalism. They have singled out a certain company, given them the sole privilege to do business, and made it illegal for other companies to do business. And the way they've done that is they've actually eliminated the taxes for the British East India Company so they don't have to pay them. In other words, only the colonists will pay the taxes. A monopoly is when one company controls a kind of business and they ultimately will control all of it. Now, most of the time when there's a monopoly, prices go up. Companies will increase prices. Just the opposite happens here. In fact, the British East India Company lowers the prices on tea so that people start buying it, because remember, they were boycotting it. And as they begin to buy it, of course, they begin to pay more taxes, and that's where things get to be a problem. The colonists feel like they were tricked into paying the taxes because the price went down. People began to fear that other monopolies are going to be created. That the British will begin to favor British companies by making sure that the laws that are passed are tailored to favoring them rather than any kind of colonial businesses. And so what do they do again? They boycott. They stop drinking tea entirely. And this is really where the switch from tea to coffee becomes very obvious in the colonies. They don't drink tea. That is a British thing. They drink coffee. That is an American thing. The result is this Boston Tea Party. Now, the Boston Tea Party is a protest that is meant to really punish the colonists or punish the British for what they've done. And so the colonists dress themselves up as Indians. And they begin to, one evening they go out to the ships and they begin to throw the tea overboard from these ships. Now, what had happened was there was a law passed in Massachusetts that said that ships that came into port needed to be unloaded in a certain amount of time. And because there was a boycott against the tea, the ships had sat there for too long. So people like Samuel Adams, for instance, and he was instrumental in organizing this, working with the Sons of Liberty. Well, they said, well, since the law says it's got to be unloaded in a certain amount of time, and those ships have been there too long, we're going to go out and load the tea for them. We're going to throw it into the harbor. And so they dress up as Indians, not because they want people to think that the Indians are attacking the ships, but just so that they won't be recognized for who they actually are, because many of them are prominent people that are living in Boston, businessmen and other people like that. Notice the crowds on the docks cheering them on. There are reports of redcoats who are there, not cheering them on, but just watching. There's not much they can do. They throw the tea overboard, they sweep up the mess on the top of the decks, they lock the ships back up. They don't destroy the ships, they just destroy the tea. But hundreds of thousands of dollars of tea have been destroyed. Not tens of thousands, not thousands, hundreds of thousands. Today it would be like millions of dollars of something being destroyed. So this is very expensive, what they've done. And who have they hit? The British East India Company. And who does that affect ultimately? The British government, because they don't get the taxes from this tea. The result is the Intolerable Acts are passed. And this is really, it's known as the Coercive Acts. The British government don't call it the Intolerable Acts, but it's meant to punish the colonists for what they've done. So this really is the last straw. This is the last thing. Because at this point, the British government says, okay, we've had enough. You can't continue to behave this way. We're going to pass a law that is going to coerce you to behave. It's going to force you to behave. And the result is that the coercive acts, which coerce means to force, really become known as the Intolerable Acts because the colonists say, we can't tolerate these. They're meant to punish the colonists for the treaty. So what do? Well, they do four things. First of all, they say, guess what? Boston Harbor is closed till the tea is paid for. Congratulations. You've now ruined your own community because we're closing down that harbor completely until you pay for the tea. Oh, and by the way, we're getting rid of your governor, and we're going to put a general in charge of Massachusetts. Next, anytime a British soldier is accused of a crime, we're going to put that soldier on a British ship, send him back to England. He'll have his trial back there. He's not having his trial in the colonies, which means British soldiers can get away with an awful lot. And last but not least, no more meeting together in town meetings. No more town meetings allowed in the colonies. And that includes, by the way, churches. Churches are shut down because of this, because you cannot meet together in groups of more than a few people without looking suspicious. Why? Well, because most of the organization takes place in Boston and other places are groups of people known as the Sons of Liberty getting together. So a group called the Committees of Correspondence is organized, and the Committees of Correspondence is sort of a secret committee of communication. Their job is to write letters. These are kind of like chain letters. So they write a letter, and they send that letter off with information to other people, who then copy the letter and send it off to other people, and it continues and continues and continues, the news spreading from one colony to another. So we go back now to join or die, and we are at a point now where the colonies are beginning to realize we have a choice to make. We can either join together as colonies or die at the hands of the British, essentially as slaves to the British, being forced to live our lives in a certain way, to pay taxes, to contribute to the British government, to help pay for, remember, the French and Indian War. So at this point, you should have a better understanding now, thinking about natural rights, thinking about what occurs over about a 10-year period. You should have a better opportunity and a better understanding of how to answer that essential question.